Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another player ranking for a season of reality television I've done a retrospective on, and here I'll be doing a player ranking for Big Brother Canada 2. So obviously here we'll be ranking the 15 players of this season based on how I feel like they played on this season, and let's just jump right into it. At number 15, the person I think played the worst on this season ends up being a Nick, the first boot. And I mean, there really isn't that much to really say about Nick. Obviously, we didn't get that much of her on the show. She was only in 2 episodes, really only 1 real episode. And we don't really get that much explanation of why she got voted out outside of the fact that she just didn't fit in. So it did seem like she annoyed people at points. And we do see her having like a tiff with Aika, which, I mean, to be fair, isn't that hard to do, but it did seem like she was just kind of lackluster socially, which through that and her obviously being one of the first out of the immunity challenge, that just made her an easy target. Now, again, do I think there's other people on the season that played actively worse at points? Yes, I do, but I do think of Nick, considering she was the first boot and didn't really do anything positive, kind of what leaves her here at number 15. Now number 14, I mean, I think you could definitely make the argument of this being a worse played game. However, at number 14, I do have Paul, and Paul is a really interesting case here, as his game is really bad. I mean, it's undeniable how bad his game is. However, again, I feel like there's still like a sprinkle of positivity to say about him, which I don't really have about a Nick. Again, I think Paul, again, does a really good job at convincing people to drop out to give him the first HOH, which again, if he were a more competent player, would have been a pretty good position to be in. Again, him being the older guy in the house would have given him a lot of leverage in the game, and I do think that would have been a good spot for him to be in if he didn't play extremely sloppily. Now, obviously, yes, he does play extremely sloppily. This says that he does make these final 2 deals constantly, and everyone knows that he's doing so. His entire relationship with Andrew is also just really strange, in him making personal attacks against Andrew in an attempt to be the bad guy, which all of that is really weird. Like, really, I think his week 2 is pretty poor play and really just gets saved by the fact that obviously Kyle was looked at as a bigger threat than him. But then once we get to week 3, again, he does come extremely close to staying. I mean, there was a point in that week where he was staying, where the women were together in voting out Heather. However, obviously due to how much he burned his relations with Andrew and Kenny, they end up flipping over the women of the first 5. But again, there was at least a point where he was staying. I think that's something to at least mention here. Now, again, did he do poor play even in that week? Yes. But overall, again, his game is just really sloppy. Again, his blatantness in him making deals that gets him caught up there, and then also his attempts to be the bad guy in an attempt for people to want to keep him around were also just strange, and just overall, again, not a good player, but he's here at 14. Number 13, moving on to a game that is essentially just a step above Paul, and here we do have Kyle, who was obviously booted before Paul, though, again, I think Kyle does less wrong. Now, I think Kyle still does stuff wrong. I think he does come off a bit cocky at first, that kind of put this target on his back through him being this more physical guy, especially this physical guy that wasn't within the first 5 alliance. But even beyond that, he wasn't really that good socially, to where he was kind of ostracized from the house and was aligned with Paul and Adele, who were the outsiders in the game, despite the fact that, again, someone like Kyle is something that you would expect to be brought into a majority alliance most times on Big Brother, yet the fact that he was ostracized on this season, I think, is even more indicative of his overall social play. But at the same time, again, I don't think that stuff is as bad as Paul, who does a lot more actively bad in the game. And while Kyle does survive over him, it was, again, largely this notion that he was a bigger threat than Paul, more so than anything Paul did on his own. And again, it's those minor positives there that do leave Kyle above Paul here at number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to a player that's obviously much higher rated when I rank every BB Can player, though when ranking their game on this season, it is pretty bad. And that person is Aika. And Aika's game on BB Can 2 is actually extraordinarily bad. I actually kind of forgot how bad it was until this latest rewatch, where she's really on the outside of the majority for most of the season. It's constantly being looked at as this big threat on the opposing side for the first 5, to where she was just constantly a target throughout a lot of the season. And despite that, she never seems to fully recognize that and plays way too safe in the game, which, again, obviously she comes back for BB Can 5 and ends up rectifying a lot of those issues. But on this season, I mean, her game is really bad. I mean, she's on the block week 1 as a pawn, to which even during that, that, she's still causing friction in the house. Now, she does end up having pretty strong bonds early on with the likes of Neta and Rochelle and Sabrina, though obviously by the time of her boot, those end up crumbling. She does later bond with Adele during her HOH week, which, again, cool that she's picking up a number, though also she doesn't really do anything with it. And her entire plan of putting Heather and Paul on the block against each other to get rid of Heather is such a wasted move at that point in the game, at this point in the game where Kenny and Andrew are directly coming for her, and for her to not go after one of them, partially due to the manipulation from the first 5, is really suboptimal play from her, but also just really petty play, where you feel like a lot of it is just her hatred of Heather, and her overall treatment of Heather on this season is, again, not good personally, but also not good gameplay wise either, considering Heather seemed like someone that actually wanted to work with Aika. Despite having the veto in week 3, she still doesn't end up going after Andrew and Kenny, and ends up losing a potential ally in Paul during that week while keeping in a major foil for her and Heather. Again, all that is really bad, like really an all-time worse HOH week, especially considering coming into the following week, she was pretty much a goner under most circumstances, only for Rochelle to win HOH, one of her closest allies, and Rochelle being convinced to backdoor Aika. Like, oh, really, really bad. Like, to be honest, like, I actually very much considered putting Aika even lower on this list, but the reason I didn't is because she at least had a good chunk of allies in the game early on. It wasn't the initial social pariah, so again, for me, it's good enough to put her at number 12, but again, it is a really bad game. Now, number 11, we're actually jumping forward quite a bit in terms of placements, and here we're moving on to the person that got Aika out of the game, and here we do have Rochelle. And Rochelle was just such a perplexing player in my mind, in the sense that I really just don't get what Rochelle was doing for a lot of this season. She seemed to be a largely emotional player for the first few weeks, and then once she became HOH, just became a blind follower to Sabrina, where during those first few weeks, she had this feud with Heather and seemed to be pretty gung-ho on needing Heather out, to the point where she's one of the people blindsided by Paul staying over Heather, but immediately following that, again, wins HOH, and uses that HOH to backdoor one of her closest allies in Aika, just due to the fact that Sabrina told her to, which, I mean, to be fair, her making this move does allow her to essentially be the 6th within the first 5, but again, she's just 6th, and had that alliance steamrolled, there's no chance she was getting anywhere close to the end there. But really, from that point forward, she is on the first 5 side of things. She is aligned with Sabrina, and is just out of the loop in the following rounds as Sabrina was. Does surprisingly vote out Sabrina over Kenny, so that doesn't lead to anything. And then we obviously have all the wasted potential with the Arley move, where that was a position where the Gremlins plus Allison really could have taken control of the game and turned the numbers completely on their side, and they just don't take that. Mind you, yeah, it seemed like Rochelle was deeply considering it, but also it's like at the end of the day, I think Rochelle would have had the least amount in agency in actually making that move go through, but not going through with that move, she's essentially just an easy target for the next few rounds, where obviously Allison goes first, but then she goes immediately after that, with her being the more threatening of the Gremlins due to the fact that she could do better in competitions. But again, it's not really due to anything she actually does in the game outside of just competitions. But again, she just really seemed to not have any true strategic ability in the game. She seemed to be passable socially, to where the people that she was good with, she was really good with, mind you, she also ostracized other people, namely Heather. And while she was propped up as being good at competition, she only wins one HOH. Like, really, for me, I don't feel like there's much to really praise with Rochelle's game on this season, because that, for me, she's here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're going back to boot order here, and here we do have Andrew, who is kind of a tough player to assess in the fact that, obviously, he was the central figure in the first 5 alliance. He was this big target for a lot of the opposition in the house, and through that, I think you could just look at him as the shield for the likes of a Kenny and an Arley and a Sarah, but I also feel like he actually had some decent-ish game ability to him. And while, again, I think you can credit a lot of his strategic maneuvering to Kenny, which, and we'll later talk about, I do think Andrew does some decent-ish work at points. Again, he does go through the back door of Kyle, which was probably the better move during his HOH, or while it leaves Paul in the game, it's like, what is Paul really gonna do? I knew that's a decision he had to be convinced by Kenny to do, but following week, again, him Paul over Heather, I think that's a move that I'll give him and Kenny a lot of credit for as well, in terms of them using their connections in the first 5 in order to get that vote through. The eventual backdoor of Aika was also a move that greatly benefited him, and again, it's largely due to his influence within the first 5. Mind you, again, a lot of that is shared credit with Kenny, to where I would give Kenny more of the credit But I think even the partial credit for those moves is enough to land him above Rochelle. Now again, outside that, was he that good at the game? Not really. I do think socially he left a lot to be desired. While again, he's not one of these people that is very good with these people immediately surrounding him, I do think he's also really bad with a lot of the rest of the house, where, and he was the direct target for around half the house by the time he goes home. Well, again, he does get kind of screwed over by Candace HOH. It's also a situation where that would have just happened had any of the other side won HOH anyway. So there were decent odds of him landing in that situation no matter what. And he's another one of these people that is propped up quite a bit as this really strong competitor. He really only wins 2 competitions, both of them being back-to-back in the first veto and the following HOH, which, again, doesn't really scream out to me that he's the best physical competitor in the world, even though, again, he did come in second quite a bit. But overall, again, Andrew played a very flawed game here still a game that, again, was poised to be taken out around this point in the game due to how much out in front he was, though still think there's like a little impressive moments here and there that do land him here at number 10. Now, number 9, and we're moving on to a player that I think I expected to be higher on this list coming into it. However, after my latest rewatch, I think I've gone down on my opinion of this person, especially in terms of their individual game on this season. That person is Sarah. And Sarah's a player that I've always looked at as one of the better pre-jury boots a BB can, being a very capable, social, and strategic player, and one that was playing both sides. And while that kind of is the case, she obviously does blow up that spot by week 3, largely due to her connections to the first 5. And she obviously picks the first 5 over her girls' alliance, which I don't think is necessarily the incorrect move. However, I think her really exposing her game in that position is something I do very much question, especially considering a lot of it is really just due to the fact of she's making that move to save Andrew and Kenny. Like, it feels like she's more so playing the games of Andrew and Kenny than she is playing her own individual game. As I think it would be understandable if it was a direct situation where Andrew or Kenny were on the block and she had to save one of them, but again, it was a fight between Paul and Heather, where really, I mean, both of them probably would have went for Andrew and Kenny if they had won. I think her sticking her neck out that much over a pretty minuscule choice in my mind is definitely a flaw. Now, again, I think there is the argument that she was screwed over by the Candace HOH. I will also state that just in general, moving forward, I don't really look at that as the first 5 really getting screwed over. I think they were kind of in that position for really the last couple weeks, where had the right person won HOH, they would have been directly targeted. Essentially just made it a guarantee instead of a 50% chance of it happening that week. But even within that, while she was someone that was closely aligned with Arley, and Arley wanted to bring her to the other side, she doesn't really fully commit to that. Still making it very clear that she's aligned with Kenny, which makes it so that Arley has to eventually drop her, and she becomes secondary target during her eventual boot week, with Kenny winning the veto, and she gets sent out there. Like, to me, again, I feel like it's a game that has potential in it for sure. Again, I think her first few weeks were very impressive in her playing the middle of the house. However, after she exposes her spot there, it really just feels like she's playing for Kenny and largely gets taken out due to her relationship with Kenny. And for me, that's such a massive downside of her game, to where while I did come into this list expecting her to be much higher than her actual placement on the season, I kind of realized that I simply can't because of how much I feel like she actively messed up her back half of her game, because that for me, she is here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to another player that I found very tough to assess on this list, because it's a player that I think demonstrated a lot of potential in the game, though really ends up wasting that potential at the very end, though also came in with a massive disadvantage, and that player is Allison, who again just has a very strange game to assess, largely because a lot of her game is dictated by the fact that she came in late. She did not enter until week 3, which is actually insane when you think about it. I actually forgot that it was until after the Kyle eviction that she gets added to the game, but once that happened, she is in this really tough spot to where obviously status quo had already been in place for around 2 weeks, and for her to just randomly be added to that is a very difficult position to be in, to try to gain social capital. And despite that disadvantage, I think she actually plays it pretty well. I mean, she instantly latches on to Andrew and starts to showmance with him, which puts her in decent standing with the first 5. And while there is talk about eventually cutting Allison to separate her and Andrew, it never really comes to fruition. She's obviously put on the block week 4, though that was always a pawn situation. She wasn't really ever going home. And once Kenny is evicted, I feel like she plays the middle pretty well, to where she ends up being added to the Sloppy Seconds alliance. And while she is on the bottom of that alliance, she at least is aware of her being on the bottom of that alliance and plays both sides, and obviously makes the move with the power of veto to save Sabrina. And that puts puts her in a really powerful position in the game. Though obviously the issue comes from the fact that despite how much she recovered her game, being in this potentially game-winning situation when her game should have been doomed coming into it, she then really just botches it by voting out Arley. A move that Allison seemed to be more resolute in making than the likes of the Gremlins, at least at first. And it's really just such a short-sighted move. Obviously, as we see, she's literally the next boot. While Arley was a threat in the game, one that probably would have beaten her if she had gotten to the end, it's also only one threat in the game in comparison to the other side, which has both John and Neta, who are both big threats in the game, while also leaving no targets for them for the following round. Where leaving Arley in at least makes it so that Arley is the big threat coming into the following round. And again, it's just a really short-sighted move. One that is a shame considering I do think if they had kept Arley around, Allison would have actually been in a pretty good spot to win the game, where they would have had a numbers advantage. And as long as Arley and John were cut along the way, I do feel like Allison would have been in this pretty good spot to eventually comp out and easily win against either of Rochelle or Sabrina. So again, I do feel like Allison has a pretty understated game on this season, though it is very flawed by that one massive mistake she ends up making, which is why it's here number 8. Now, number 7, moving on to a game that is another one very tough to assess. However, we're jumping all the way to a finalist, and here we do have Sabrina. And Sabrina's game here is kind of a strange one, where it is one where the first third of her game is actually pretty solid. Again, she is the person that gets the first 5 together, and then ends up being a mole for the first 5. For a lot of the early game, ends up doing some pretty good work in convincing the people on the other side to do things for the first 5's benefit, particularly convincing Aika to not go after the boys. You also have her convincing Rochelle to take out Aika, which I think is her shining moment there. But again, the issue there is, again, like Sarah, I feel like she was playing for the boys, where even had she made it to the end with the first 5, I feel like it's very improbable that she was going to win that game, especially considering how much more out in front the likes of a Kenny and an Arley would have been at that point in the game, and also considering how no one really took Sabrina seriously, which that is obviously a thing to talk about here, is how Sabrina just came off as extremely emotional throughout this game, and through that no one really took her seriously, to where it seemed like the only person that she could truly manipulate on this season was Rochelle, which it's Rochelle. But again, that first third is pretty good. It's just the back third is just really bad, where from that point on, she's on the bottom and just constantly on the bottom, scraping by. The one point where she has any point of agency is the Arley vote, where again, she really botches it there and is essentially just kind of dragged through the game for a lot of the rest of the game, particularly by Neta, who recognizes that Sabrina is the easiest person to beat at the very end, where Neta actively campaigns to keep Sabrina around at the final 5 round, and Sabrina ends up winning HOH at 4. And by 3, it's obviously just kind of obvious that whoever takes Sabrina is going to win. So again, it's a bad game in my mind. It's a game where Sabrina was not really knowing what was truly going on for back 2/3 of the game. But again, it is the impressiveness of the first third, plus also the fact that she at least made it to the very end, which is what leaves you here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a player that I remember really liking when the show aired, though it's kind of undeniable that he's not the greatest player in the world. And at number 6, we do have Adele. And Adele is an interesting player in the sense that he obviously starts off on the bottom. He is aligned with the Paul and Kyles of the world as they get taken out one by one. Despite being on the bottom, he's never really a target. He is a pretty decent social player, to where he does obviously build this really strong bond with Aika. And beyond that, again, like the likes of Aika were going to be targeted over him. John was even a target before him. Heather was obviously a target before him. It's like, despite Adele not really being involved in any of the strategic maneuverings early on in the game, he was never really a target. And to fair, you could say that some of that is just because they didn't look at him as a threat. And again, is he even that much of a threat? I don't know, because again, he doesn't win any competitions until the final 6. And even then, isn't the most strategically minded player, or at least not the greatest strategic player. How much of that was actually warranted? But again, the thing that Adele is very good at is building these one-on-one bonds. Again, he's able to flip over Aika and almost is able to save Paul through that. He is able to build this really strong bond with John, that leads to the building of the other side of the house. Problem is that while he does then find himself in the majority when joining the sloppy seconds, he's always towards the bottom of that group. So while he does have a final 3 of Arley and John, that was never a real final 3, especially from John's perspective, who I don't think was ever going to go through with that. And despite Adele being 100% loyal to John, constantly talking about wanting to take John to final 2, John never really seems to reciprocate that. He even puts Adele up against Arley in a position where Adele could have easily gone home there. And I do think during his HOH, he really just wastes a pretty big opportunity there to take out John and Neta, instead going after the Gremlins, which is such a waste of a move there. Though at the same time, time. Could he have actually gotten rid of Neta during that week? Not entirely sure, but it definitely would have been his optimal play there. Though I will say, I do think his actual boot round is just kind of unlucky circumstances. It's kind of a double-sided thing of the fact that Heather was the initial target, Heather wins veto, and through that Adele goes on the block, but even then, John wants to keep Adele in the game, only for Neta to strong-arm him and vote him out anyway. Again, it is kind of unlucky circumstances there, though still, the fact that he wasn't able to get John to flip against Neta earlier, I think is a knock against him. And just overall, again, I think he is a very good social player, especially with one-on-one bonds. However, I do think a largely lacking player in other aspects of the game, but still gets the final 5 in a position where he's relatively close to the end. I mean, Neta did openly express wanting to potentially take Adele to the end, towards the end game, but still he was striving to go to the end against John, who would have lost again. So again, it's a lot of really suboptimal play, and that's why he's here number 6. Number 5, we're moving on to a player that's one step above Adele in my mind, and that person is Heather. And really for me, Adele and Heather are mostly interchangeable. I think there is maybe a slight difference between the two, but I think they are very similar style of players. Heather also found herself on the bottom very early on in the game, and unlike Adele, was actually directly targeted multiple times, only to be saved by, well, first time being against Paul, but the second time being against a bigger threat in Aika. She also, again, is part of the sloppy second. She is part of this majority that takes control of the game after Canada's HOH, and through that is also in a similar spot to Adele in the game, kind of being this potential third for John and Neta. Though I do think Heather does a lot more active work while in that position, where again, Adele kind of just has his final 3 with John and Arley, and is kind of resolute in that, where I do think Heather actually makes these final 2 deals with Neta and with John, and then makes a final 3 with the both of them, and at least puts in more work there. And while again, it was all for naught, as none of those deals were actually that true, I do feel like it's still at least more active work from Heather in that position than Adele. And then her endgame is, again, similar to Adele, just without the terrible final 6 move of not going against John and Neta then. And while she was the initial target for final 5, she obviously wins veto, though again, it is a knock the fact that both John and Neta actually want her out at that point, especially from Neta's perspective, who, again, I don't think Neta should have been wanting Heather out at that point. So again, that's definitely a lot rockier, though again, like at the end of the day, I look at her game very similar to Adele. I think they have very similar trajectories in the game, very similar highs and lows, and while I think you can argue Adele probably had more potential of actually reaching the end of the game than Heather, who's looked at as a bigger threat, I do still respect that Heather at least plays more when she's on top than Adele seemed to. So again, it's that very minor change that leaves Heather for me at number 5. And at number 4, we're moving on to a player that I have much higher than their actual placement, though I think when looking at their game, it is largely warranted. At number 4, I do have Kenny. And again, Kenny, despite being 9th place on this season, I think plays a very impressive game. Again, he is really running the show for the first half of the season. He is obviously in the first 5 alliance, but is also the main strategist for that alliance, is most central player in that alliance. Again, he is using Andrew as a shield, but also has this very solid relationship with Andrew, to where they obviously had a very good working relationship. Kenny really being the one to dictate what strategic move they were going to end up making. Kenny really being the mastermind between the cow back door and obviously being involved in taking out Paul and Aika. And once Canada's HOH happens, it obviously does secure that first 5 member is going home. But I will say, I do think he gets slightly benefited from the fact that it's a Canada HOH and not the HOH of someone from the other side, as I do think if someone from the other side had one HOH, it would have been him and Andrew on the block, and I think there would have been a serious chance of them voting out Kenny over Andrew, even in that position. So I think in a way, he was slightly benefited from the twist, at least benefited from his worst case scenario happening. But either way, he obviously loses Andrew, but once he loses Andrew, while he is the biggest target for the other side, he's actually still in a pretty strong position on his side. He is still the leader of his side and really has these numbers that are willing to fight for him. The likes of Sabrina, Rochelle, Sarah, even Allison, I think would have been willing to save him if they had the numbers. And again, that's a pretty strong position for Kenny to be in, despite the fact that his game had seemingly crumbled around him. It really is a series of unlucky HOH wins that really causes Kenny to be taken out, which is obviously part of the game, though I still think when looking at this list and looking at the best players from this season, I do feel like Kenny does a lot right on this season. And while again, I think he still puts him out in front a bit too much, to where even though, yes, he is using Andrew as a shield, I don't feel like he uses Andrew as a shield enough to where Kenny is still very out there. And people seem to acknowledge the fact that Kenny is the brains behind the operation, which I think would have put him in danger anyway. But again, I still think Kenny, again, had a lot of social acumen in the game, had a good amount of strategic acumen, and was also really good at competition. So because of that, for me, Kenny is here at number 4. At number 3, we're moving on to a player that is a step above Kenny, and the fact that this player outplayed Kenny, and that person is Arley. And Arley is a strange player for me to assess on this season, as I do think for the first half of the season, I think he was the best position player in the game. He was the person that was playing the middle, probably the best, playing the first 5 and then also the sloppy seconds, and really playing them against each other. And then once the first 5 had lost favor, he fully flips over to the sloppy second side of things, which I think is where I probably do knock him a bit. In the fact that I do feel like while he does do some good work in building some relationships on the other side, and he obviously has his final 3 with Adele and John, along with the final 2 with John, I don't feel like he does enough work there to really secure his position on the other side, especially when he was such a big target on the board, and now had made it openly known to everyone that he was the one that flipped, especially once he takes out Sarah, which again, I do think is also a misplay from him, getting rid of Sarah, someone that was tightly aligned to him. I think he should have tried to get the likes of Sabrina or Rochelle out over Sarah. But even then, in his actual boot round, he does come extremely close to staying. Mind you, part of that is due to the secret veto, where if that had not happened, he would have been on the block against Sabrina, to where he would have been a goner, though in the block against Adele, again, it came very close. And again, he does get outplayed by John and Neta at the very end, which, again, we haven't talked about them yet. So in comparison to the rest of the field, I do think Arley does play extremely well. Again, I do think he was running circles around most of the house for first half of the game, but then I think he really just mismanages his threat level towards the middle of the game by getting rid of Kenny and really empowering the sloppy second side a bit too much, to where he was the prime target by the time of the final 8. But I still think overall, again, a solid game, one that demonstrated a lot of impressive play from the middle, while also setting up his position on both sides. And because of that, for me, Arley's still here at number 3. Now number 2, and obviously 1 and 2 are John and Neta. I mean, that's undeniable. However, at number 2, I'm actually going with the winner of the season, and that is John. And this is a bit of a change from how I probably would have had it during my last rewatch of BB Can too, as I do feel like John on the rewatch is a player that, while I do think he does have some really impressive play at points, making some really big moves, I feel like he makes a lot of those big moves for Neta. And I think a lot of the game he is playing for Neta. And it's not until the final 5 where obviously he starts to piece together that Neta is also playing her own game and starts to think about the possibility of not taking her to the end. But really, I do think Neta was the brains behind the operation, especially in the back half of the game. While John is better positioned than Neta early on, being aligned the first 5 side of things, he also ends up playing kind of sloppily, to where while he is making these really strong bonds, the likes of Adele and Heather and obviously Neta, he also makes it pretty well known that he is going to be targeting Andrew, which actually leads to him being, by the time of Canada's HOH, he was actually the number 1 target for the first 5 side of things. He was actually the planned target for that round if the first 5 had 1 power, which in a way makes it so that he's kind of saved by Canada's HOH. And again, not fully, as again, it's still 50-50 odds, and really just changed those 50-50 odds to 0. But still, that's not a great position to be in, where he was the target coming into that round. And also, to be fair, I don't know if he would have actually been voted out. I do think it would have been somewhat difficult to get him out, especially due to his relationship with Arley. Though at the same time, if he was on the block against someone like Neta, I think they're more than likely voting John out. But still, once he recovers from that during Canada's HOH, I do think he plays very impressively from that point. Obviously, you see the creation of the sloppy seconds, to where he's really at the top of that alliance alongside Neta. You also see him build this alliance with Arley, alongside a final 3 with Adele. He also ends up having a final 2 with Heather. He also has Adele wanting to take him to final 2. And all that is a pretty impressive position to be in. Mind you, I think an issue here also is the fact that the other side is openly targeting him. Or while they never do end up winning power moving forward, if they did, John would have been the target for them. However, to counter that, I do think he does pretty impressive work by the time of the final 8, where by the time of the final 8, we do see him build numerous final 4 deals involving the Gremlins and another one involving Allison that really ends up pacifying them, especially when ends up backdooring Arley, which ends up keeping their votes in line, which is a good play. Though I will say the entire backdoor of Arley is kind of sloppy play. I don't think it was a move that he needed to make. I feel like it's a move that, again, benefits Neta way more than it benefits John. But while I think John definitely needed to have Arley out by a time of like final 5 or so, I do think for him to make the move himself, especially at that point in the game, felt a bit early and kind of gets locked out by his side just winning the comps moving forward. But again, during Adele's HOH, it's impressive that Adele doesn't go after John and Neta. And a lot of that comes down to his relationship with John. Now, again, at the final 5, I think he has some sloppier play. I mean, he does initially target Heather, which is probably the best move for his game. But once Heather ends up winning the veto, he kind of lets Adele go, which I think is a misstep for him, considering Adele was such a loyal number to him. At final 4, he was in a rocky-ish position, but not dead to rights, considering obviously he saves himself, as we later see, but I also feel like Neta would have probably saved him for that position as well. And again, a lot of that comes from the fact that I think at that point he was tricking Neta. I think at that point he had already become resolute in the fact that he was going to cut Neta at the end. I think that decision largely comes from the final 5 round, where at the final 5, Neta fights really hard to get rid of Adele. I think it's at that point where John starts to recognize that he should be playing the game for himself, which from that point forward, I think he was always cutting Neta, which we get to the final 3 where he obviously does so. Obviously a game-winning move at that point, as if he had taken Neta to the end, Neta would have beaten him. And again, all in all, it is a strong game. I still think it has aspects of him winning out. I think there are definitely a lot of points where he would have been in danger, though either he or his really, really close allies in winning competitions so that he never was in danger. I also think he's probably the person that was the most benefited from Canada's HOH, to where he goes from being one of the most likely targets to being locked safe. But again, I still think he does very impressive work in his alliance building and him putting together the sloppy seconds, him building this alliance with Arley and Adele. But again, I also feel like he lets his allies go at inopportune times, which is kind of what led to him having to win out at the very, very end. But still, overall, a very impressive game. Obviously showed the game acumen at the very end to cut Neta. It was a good game, but I think the other person played a bit more consistently throughout, and that's why John's here number 2. Now number 1, the number 1 player from BB Can 2 ends up being Neta. And again, for me, I think the main difference between the two is largely how much Neta gets her way towards the end game. I think really for the first half of the game, I would have probably had them around the same spot. Again, I think they were kind of in similar spots on their separate sides of. Now, obviously, John does end up cutting in Neta at the very end, and through that, they show John outplaying Neta at the very end. However, at the same time, if Neta had won HOH, she also would have cut John. So I think it's kind of a moot point there. And beyond that, I think Neta actually played probably better than John throughout most of the season. Now, initially, she wasn't as good of a spot as John was aligned with the first 5 who were running the house, while Neta was aligned with the other women who weren't running the house. But I think she was higher on that pecking order than John was on the first 5's pecking order, which I think is at least something to note there. While also, again, obviously she does build this really strong bond with John, which ends up carrying her through the game. While she was nominated in week 2, she was never actually in any true danger. Now, again, she does get blindsided week 3, which is probably the biggest demerit towards her game, is how out of the loop she was at that point in the game, along with the fact that her closest ally and Aika gets taken out in week 4. But still, by that point in the game, she was already starting to put together what would later become the sloppy seconds. By that point, the likes of John, Neta, Heather, and Adele had already come together, which, again, how much do you credit that solely to Neta? Not much. Again, I think it's really more of a collaborative effort there, but her position had definitely started to increase by that point in the game, to where by the time of Canada's HOH, and she wasn't being targeted by the other side, unlike John was, though, was actually in a very similar position. Now, I think John was probably more integrated still at that point in the game, and the fact that he had Arley being on his side and also had Adele being more loyal to him, but Neta still was very high in the pecking order on her side of things, and obviously we do see the first members of the first 5 being taken out, and Andrew, Sarah, and Kenny's of which being during her HOH, though, and again, to be fair, most people would have gone for Kenny at that position. But I do think it's at the final 8 where I think her game really starts to improve, where I think this is the first point where we actively see Neta make a move against John's best interest and convinces John to make that move. Or her getting John to backdoor Arley is very impressive, as it really weakens John's position in the game, but also greatly bolsters hers, considering Arley was probably the biggest threat to her at that point in the game and was someone that was probably coming after her relatively soon to split up her and John. So again, I think that's all really good play there, along with her and John making these deals to secure the votes by the time it eventually happens. We obviously see her winning HOH following that and taking out Allison, which again, I think is the optimal move there. We obviously see Adele win HOH and not go after Neta, despite that being in his best interest, which I do think is also, again, indicative of Neta and John's control of the game at that point. Then we get to the final 5, where again, we once again have Neta making a move against John's best interest and taking out Adele, though her initial target was Heather, which I will say, I do think that's questionable, as while Heather was better at comps than Adele, I do think Heather also was more willing to take Neta to the end than Adele. While also Adele had openly talked about how he would have voted for Neta if she had gotten to the end, so it's like, again, wouldn't you want Adele on the jury to vote for you, or Heather to be in the game to take you to the final 2, but either way, her voting out of Adele, while I do think it is the optimum move for her, I think she does push it a bit too hard, where once John starts fighting back, she really stays resolute in that and doesn't really secure John well enough there to where, again, I think that's the point where John starts to actually consider cutting Neta at the very end. Then we get to Final Four, where she does end up wanting to take John to the next round. John ends up winning his way there anyway, and she does end up having John save her there over Heather, which is pretty good play. Though at the same time, I do question if it was the optimal move to want John at Final 3 over Heather. Now, I can understand in the fact that if she goes to Final 3 with John and Sabrina, in her mind, she's securing her spot in the Final 2, while with Heather, there's a chance that Sabrina takes Heather instead of her, and also even a chance that Heather takes Sabrina, though I also feel like Heather was a lot more beatable than John in a lot of the endgame comps. So again, I think it's a little bit up in the air, but though still not something I'm really taking away from her game. But obviously, at the Final 3, it really is a point where whoever wins Final HOH wins the game. If Neta had won Final HOH, she would have cut John, she would have won. Though obviously John wins Final HOH and cuts Neta and ends up winning. Though Neta was also in this interesting spot where if John had taken Neta to the end, Neta would have beaten John there, to where Neta essentially had two kind of chances at winning the game, along with also Sabrina. To which again, Sabrina was never really getting the part 3, but Sabrina had won Final HOH, she would have taken Neta, and Neta would have beaten her as well. And Neta was in this very solid spot to win the game at Final 3, where the only way she didn't win was essentially the situation that happened of John winning HOH and finally making a move against Neta and cutting her there. Which again, I think you can attribute to some poor play from her and her not maintaining John well enough. I think if that's really her only big flaw that caused the end of her game, I think that's a good flaw to have. I feel like in comparison to the rest of the field here, I feel like everyone else has bigger demerits to their game than Neta does here. So obviously there are points where she's out of the loop, particularly weeks 3 and 4, and she does really burn her relationship with John by the time of the Final 5, but she was still in this really, really strong position to win the game by the time of Final 3, and does obviously make these moves against John's best interest. It even convinces him to do it at the Final 8, and overall, I think Neta plays an extremely impressive game on this season, which is why she's here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Big Brother Canada 2. Now moving forward, I'll be continuing to do retrospectives and player rankings for seasons like this. Like next year, you can expect one for BB Can 3. Also coming up, you can expect one for BB 5. So stay tuned for those. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.